When travelers passed through the narrow valley, 12 miles north of what would eventually become Eminence, Missouri in late March of 1885, they found 7 homesteads standing empty, doors closed but not locked, belongings arranged as if occupants had left intending to return within hours. But the families who had lived in those homesteads, 23 people total including 12 children, were gone, had been gone since the night of February 14th, when witnesses from the ridge above the valley reported seeing lights in cabin windows go out one by one over the course of several hours until the last light went dark, sometime before dawn, and the valley that had been inhabited for 6 years became a place where no one lived anymore. The families themselves were never found. No bodies were discovered in the valley or in the surrounding wilderness. No evidence of violence or struggle was visible in the abandoned cabins. Food remained on tables. Fires had burned out in stoves. Personal items that people would take if they intended to travel remained in their places. Everything suggested that the occupants had simply stopped being present without taking time to gather belongings or secure their homes, or leave any indication of where they had gone, or why they had left during the middle of a February night, when travel through snow and cold would be difficult and dangerous. Welcome to this journey through one of the most complete disappearances ever documented in frontier records. In the years when isolated valleys could lose contact with outside settlements for weeks during winter, and when spring visits sometimes revealed tragic outcomes from storms or illness or accidents that had claimed entire families, there lived 7 families in a valley where witnesses watched their lights go out during a single night, and where those families vanished so completely that no trace of their departure was ever found, despite extensive searching, and despite the fact that 23 people moving through winter wilderness should have left evidence that would remain visible for weeks after the movement occurred. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the boundary between disappearance that can be explained and disappearance that resists all explanation, because the evidence, or lack of evidence, describes something that should not be possible. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Before we enter that valley and watch lights go dark, consider what isolated valleys meant to frontier families, and why settlers understood that choosing to live in enclosed terrain created dependencies on outside contact that open terrain did not create. Valleys offered advantages: shelter from wind, access to water, soil that was often richer than hillside ground, but they also created isolation that could become dangerous if illness struck multiple families simultaneously, or if winter conditions prevented travel for extended periods. Most families who chose valley living managed the isolation successfully through establishing regular contact schedules with neighbors outside the valley, and through maintaining supplies adequate for weeks of self-sufficiency if contact became impossible. The arrangement worked because it was reciprocal. Valley families checked on outside neighbors checked on valley families, and mutual dependence created networks that prevented isolation from becoming abandonment. The families in the valley north of Eminence had followed this pattern successfully for 6 years. 7 homesteads had been established in 1879, positioned along the valley floor where spring water and good soil made farming viable. The families knew each other, cooperated during harvest and during emergencies, and maintained regular contact with families who lived on the ridges surrounding the valley. Through 6 winters, they had managed isolation without unusual incident, had survived storms and cold that were severe but not unprecedented, and had given no indication that valley living created stresses they could not manage. The winter of 1884 to 1885 had been typical through January. Snow fell, cold settled, and the valley families remained in occasional contact with ridge neighbors through brief visits when weather allowed. The last confirmed contact between valley and ridge occurred on February 11th, when Daniel Crawford from the valley traveled to the Morrison homestead on the eastern ridge to purchase salt and to report that valley families were managing winter adequately and had sufficient supplies to last through remainder of the season. Morrison asked Crawford whether the valley families planned to attend the community gathering scheduled for late February. Crawford said they would attend if weather permitted, but that current snow depth made travel difficult and that, if conditions did not moderate, they would wait for spring contact. Morrison found nothing unusual in this response. Winter often prevented attendance at gatherings, and valley families missing February meetings was not unprecedented. Crawford returned to the valley on February 11th. Morrison watched him descend the trail that led from ridge to valley floor, watched him until he disappeared into the tree line, and that was the last confirmed sighting of anyone from the valley alive and engaged in normal activity. 3 days later, on the night of February 14th, Frank Morrison's son Thomas was returning to the family homestead after visiting neighbors to the north. His route took him along the eastern ridge above the valley, and from that elevation, the lights from valley cabin windows were visible on clear nights when families had lamps or fires burning. Thomas had traveled this route many times after dark, and had often noted valley lights as landmarks that helped orient his position along the ridge trail. On the night of February 14th, Thomas noticed valley lights as he began his journey south along the ridge. He counted them, as he sometimes did, 7 separate points of light corresponding to the 7 homesteads he knew occupied the valley floor. The lights appeared normal, showed no unusual brightness or dimness, gave no indication that anything was wrong in the valley below. Thomas continued south. The ridge trail required attention, especially at night, and he did not constantly watch the valley lights, but glanced toward them periodically as he progressed. Sometime around 9 o'clock, Thomas could not be certain of exact time, but estimated based on how long he had been traveling. He glanced toward the valley and noticed that he could see only 6 lights instead of 7. He stopped, counted carefully, verified that 1 light was no longer visible. He knew the valley layout well enough to identify which homestead's light had gone dark. The northernmost cabin, the Patterson family, had no visible light burning. Thomas considered this briefly, decided it was not unusual. Families extinguished lights when going to sleep, and 9 o'clock was a reasonable time for a family to settle for the night. He continued south. Perhaps 30 minutes later, he glanced again toward the valley. Now only 5 lights were visible. 2 more had gone dark while he traveled. Again he stopped, counted, verified. The pattern seemed unusual. 3 families extinguishing lights within an hour suggested coordination or coincidence that seemed unlikely but not impossible. Thomas felt the first stirring of unease, but had no framework for understanding what the darkening lights might indicate beyond families going to sleep earlier than usual. He moved faster along the ridge trail, paying more attention now to the valley below. Over the next 2 hours, he watched as lights continued to disappear. By 11 o'clock, only 3 lights remained visible. By midnight, only 1 light still burned. Thomas reached his family's homestead around 12:30 and immediately told his father what he had observed. Frank Morrison listened, tried to determine if what Thomas was describing indicated emergency requiring immediate response or was simply unusual pattern of normal behavior. Morrison decided that investigating in darkness would be dangerous and potentially unnecessary, that waiting for morning would allow assessment in daylight when travel was safer, and when whether valley families were experiencing crisis or were simply sleeping could be determined more accurately. Through the remainder of the night, Thomas checked periodically on the valley from windows that faced west. The single remaining light continued to burn through 1 o'clock, through 2 o'clock. Sometime between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, Thomas had fallen asleep at his watch position. The last light went out. When he woke at dawn and looked toward the valley, no lights were visible in any of the 7 cabin windows. Morrison and his son descended to the valley at first light on February 15th. The journey down the ridge trail took 40 minutes through snow that was deep but passable. As they approached the valley floor, Morrison called out, expecting valley families to respond if they were present and engaged in morning activities. No response came. The valley was silent. They reached the first homestead, the Patterson cabin where Thomas had first noticed a dark window. Morrison knocked, called out, received no answer. He tried the door and found it unlatched. He entered the cabin, expecting to find the family sleeping, or ill, or in some state that would explain the silence. The cabin was empty. The Patterson family, husband, wife, and 3 children, were not present. The cabin showed evidence of recent occupation, but not evidence of current presence. The stove was cold, the fire long extinguished. Food sat on the table, as if meal preparation had been interrupted. Clothing and personal items remained in their normal positions. Nothing suggested the family had packed for travel or had gathered belongings for departure. Morrison and Thomas moved to the second homestead. Empty. The third homestead. Empty. They worked through all 7 cabins systematically, finding the same pattern in each: absence of people, presence of belongings, no sign of violence or struggle, no indication of where occupants had gone. 23 people had vanished from 7 homesteads during a single night. Morrison stood in the silent valley, trying to understand what evidence he was seeing. 7 families had been present on February 11th, when Crawford had returned to the valley. 7 families had apparently been present on the evening of February 14th, when lights burned in cabin windows. But by morning of February 15th, all 7 families were gone, had left without gathering possessions, without leaving notes, without creating visible trail through snow that should have shown direction of travel if travel had occurred. Morrison searched the area immediately surrounding each cabin, looking for tracks that would indicate departure. The snow was trampled near cabin doors from normal daily movement, but no clear trails led away from the homesteads into the surrounding forest or up the valley walls toward the ridge trails. The snow should have preserved any tracks made during the previous 3 days. It had been cold enough that new snow had not fallen to cover old tracks, and wind had not been strong enough to fill footprints completely. Yet no evidence of mass exodus was visible in any direction. Over the following days, Morrison organized more extensive searching. Men from ridge homesteads came to help, bringing knowledge of the terrain and experience with winter tracking. They searched the valley floor, examined the walls, checked the trails that led out of the valley toward ridge settlements. They searched for bodies, assuming that perhaps all 23 people had died from illness or poison or carbon monoxide from improperly vented stoves, and that bodies were somewhere near the cabins waiting to be found. They found nothing. No bodies, no tracks. No evidence that would explain sudden simultaneous disappearance of 7 families. The searching expanded to the wilderness surrounding the valley. If valley families had left for some reason, they would have moved in some direction, and that direction should be discoverable through tracking. Teams spread through the forest, examining snow for any indication of passage. They found game trails, found occasional tracks from individual hunters or travelers who had passed through the region, but found nothing suggesting movement of 23 people through terrain that would be difficult for such a large group to traverse without leaving substantial evidence. Some proposed that the families had left voluntarily, that some emergency had caused all 7 families to depart simultaneously during the night. But where were the tracks that such departure must have created? A few people mentioned Thomas's observation about lights going out sequentially through the evening of February 14th. As weeks passed with no new evidence and no discovery of the missing families, searching decreased. The valley cabins stood empty through remainder of winter. Occasional visitors entered them looking for clues that earlier searches had missed, but nothing emerged that explained what had happened on the night of February 14th. Spring thaw in late March brought hope that melting snow might reveal evidence that winter conditions had concealed. Searchers returned to the valley, expecting to find bodies or tracks or some physical proof of what had occurred. The thaw revealed nothing. By summer, neighbors began dismantling the abandoned cabins, salvaging materials for use in their own homes. The personal belongings left behind were claimed by distant relatives, when relatives could be identified or distributed among ridge families when no claimants emerged. The valley itself was avoided, not because anyone could articulate why it should be avoided, but because the complete disappearance of 23 people created unease that made resettling seem unwise. Over subsequent years, occasional reports emerged of travelers who passed through the valley at night and who reported seeing lights in windows where no cabins stood anymore. Lights that would burn for brief periods before going dark in the same sequential pattern that Thomas Morrison had observed on February 14th, 1885. These reports were generally dismissed as imagination or as misidentification of natural phenomena, but they were consistent enough that the valley's reputation as a place where something had happened, something that had taken 23 people without leaving evidence that would allow understanding of how the taking had occurred, became part of regional memory. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the most complete disappearances in frontier history. 7 families who were present when their valley neighbor returned on February 11th, whose lights burned in windows on the evening of February 14th, and who were gone by morning of February 15th, without leaving evidence that would allow anyone to determine where they had gone, or how they had managed to vanish so completely from a valley surrounded by snow that should have preserved proof of their departure. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where lights go dark and families vanish without trace, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries of what can be explained. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what might have caused the disappearance. And if this story resonated with you, like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozark Plateau, there is a valley where lights once went out one by one during a February night, where 7 families vanished so completely that no evidence of their departure was ever found, and where travelers still occasionally report seeing lights that burn briefly before going dark, as if the valley itself remembers the night when the last light went out before morning, and everyone who had lived there stopped being present in any way that left trace in the physical world.